At first, there was nothing remarkable about the footage. It was grainy, slightly out of focus, the kind of recording investigators see every day and usually dismiss within minutes. A fixed security camera mounted high in the corner of a private facility pointed toward a narrow corridor lined with metal doors. The timestamp glowed faintly blue in the corner of the screen. The audio track was nearly silent, just a low electrical hum. On the night in question, everyone believed the camera had been shut down. Everyone was wrong. The incident began with a call that came in just after midnight. A routine report. A discovery that didn't immediately raise alarms. An adult male found unresponsive inside a secured area of a property that was supposed to be empty. No obvious signs of forced entry. No visible struggle. No witnesses. By sunrise, the story had already taken shape. Authorities were told the system was offline that night. Maintenance had been scheduled. The camera in the corridor, according to multiple people, had been switched off hours earlier. Whatever happened inside that building, they said, happened unseen. And for weeks, that explanation held. The man who was found had no known enemies, no public conflicts, no criminal history that would draw attention. His death was initially classified as unexplained but not suspicious. The location was controlled. Access was limited. Everyone who had been inside the building that evening provided statements that aligned almost perfectly. Too perfectly. Investigators noted it quietly at first. The timelines fit, but they fit in a way that felt rehearsed. Everyone remembered the same details. Everyone agreed on when the camera went dark. Everyone described the same sequence of routine actions leading up to the discovery. It was clean, convenient, and easy to close. So they did. The file was marked inactive. The footage was archived with hundreds of other irrelevant recordings. The case moved on, filed under no further action. But what no one noticed, what no one thought to question, was a single automated process buried deep in the system's configuration. The camera hadn't been turned off. It had been switched to overwrite mode. That meant the system continued recording, cycling data internally, storing footage temporarily before deleting it. Normally, those files disappeared within days. But a minor glitch, something as simple as a delayed system update, had frozen the overwrite cycle. The footage remained. For nearly 3 months, no one knew it existed. The rediscovery didn't come from law enforcement. It came from a technician assigned to audit the facility's security systems for an unrelated reason. He wasn't looking for evidence. He wasn't reviewing cases. He was checking storage integrity. That's when he noticed it. A block of data flagged as corrupted, but not empty. He played it. The screen flickered. The corridor appeared. Empty at first. Still. Silent. Then movement. At 11:47 p.m., a door opened at the far end of the hallway. A figure stepped out, partially obscured by shadow. The timestamp was clear. The camera angle was fixed. There was no doubt about the location. The camera was on. The technician stopped the playback, restarted it, watched again. Over the next hour, the footage captured more movement. People entering the corridor, leaving, returning, pausing in places they claimed they were never in, standing near doors they said they never approached. Most damning of all, it captured the victim alive long after he was supposed to have left the building. The technician escalated the finding immediately. By the time investigators saw the footage, the narrative had already begun to crack. Statements were pulled. Timelines were laid out again, this time side by side with the video. Small inconsistencies emerged first. A claimed departure at 10:30 contradicted by footage at 11:12. A supposed equipment check that never happened. A brief interaction that no one mentioned. Then came the moment that changed everything. At 12:06 a.m., the camera captured an interaction that no report referenced. 2 figures stood in the corridor with the victim. Their faces weren't clearly visible, but their movements were. The positioning, the body language, the way the victim stepped back, not aggressively, not defensively, but uncertain. What happened next wasn't graphic. There was no explosion of violence. No dramatic confrontation. Just a moment where the victim disappeared from the camera's view, guided, not forced, through a door that investigators had been told remained locked all night. Minutes later, only one person came back into frame. And that person paused. They looked directly toward the camera. Not at the lens. No one could see it, but toward the corner where it was mounted. As if checking. As if confirming. The camera kept recording. That pause lasted less than 2 seconds. But it would become the most analyzed moment of the entire case. Because it suggested something chilling. They believed the camera was off. When confronted with the footage weeks later, the reactions varied. Some denied it outright. Some claimed confusion. Others insisted the timestamps were wrong, the system faulty, the footage unreliable. But the system logs told a different story. The timestamps were accurate. The internal clock had never reset. The file integrity was intact. There was no evidence of tampering. The camera hadn't malfunctioned. It had simply been ignored. As investigators dug deeper, they realized how close the truth had come to disappearing forever. Had the overwrite cycle resumed normally, the footage would have erased itself without anyone ever knowing what it captured. No one would have questioned the alibis. No one would have rebuilt the timeline. No one would have reopened the case. The victim would have remained a mystery, his final moments sealed behind confident statements and closed files. Instead, a silent camera, when everyone assumed was blind, had watched everything. And it wasn't finished telling its story. By the end of that week, the case was officially reopened. The death was reclassified. And the people who had once spoken with certainty were now being called back, one by one, to explain why their words didn't match what the camera saw. Because from that moment on, there was no debate about whether the camera was recording. The only question left was why so many people were so sure it wasn't. The moment the case was reopened, the footage stopped being just a recording. It became a measuring stick. Investigators didn't start with accusations. They started with clocks. Every statement given in the original investigation was pulled from storage and laid out in a single, continuous timeline. Arrival times, departure times, equipment logs, access card swipes, phone activity. Every minute was accounted for on paper. Then, the video was added. The differences were subtle at first, almost harmless looking. A person who said they left the building at 10:15 p.m. appeared briefly on camera at 10:41. Another who claimed they never entered the secured corridor was visible passing through it just after 11. No single discrepancy proved anything on its own. But together, they formed a pattern of certainty without accuracy. Investigators noticed something else as they reviewed the footage frame by frame. The behavior of the people captured. No one rushed. No one panicked. There was a calmness that contradicted later claims of confusion and chaos. Movements were deliberate. Doors were opened with confidence. Conversations appeared routine. This wasn't an accident unfolding in real time. It was something people expected. The victim's movements became the focal point of the review. He entered the corridor shortly before 11:30 p.m., carrying nothing but his phone. He didn't look distressed. He didn't appear threatened. But he did hesitate, just briefly, before following the others deeper into the restricted area. That hesitation would later be replayed hundreds of times, because it was the last moment the camera captured him moving freely. Investigators reconstructed the next hour using only objective data. The video showed who went where. Access logs confirmed which doors were opened. Phone records revealed short bursts of activity. Messages sent, then deleted. During moments people claimed they were alone. One message, recovered through a routine forensic request, stood out. It was sent at 11:58 p.m. to someone who had already told police they were asleep at home by then. The reply came less than a minute later. Neither message mentioned the victim. Neither sounded urgent. But their timing placed two people in direct communication, just minutes before the victim vanished from the camera's view. When questioned again, both individuals insisted it meant nothing. They said they didn't remember sending the messages. They said it must have been automatic or accidental or misunderstood. The video didn't support that. At 12:06 a.m., the same two figures appeared together in the corridor. One stood closer to the camera. The other positioned themselves nearer to the door the victim would soon disappear through. The spacing wasn't random. It looked coordinated. What happened next unfolded quietly. The victim stepped backward, out of frame. The door closed. The corridor emptied. From that moment on, the camera recorded nothing but stillness. No one else passed through for nearly 40 minutes. That gap became one of the most troubling aspects of the case. According to earlier statements, multiple people should have been moving through the area during that time. Routine checks, equipment inspections, end-of-shift procedures. None of it appeared on video. Either everyone had lied, or they had avoided the camera entirely. Investigators turned their attention to the layout of the building. They discovered alternative routes that bypassed the corridor, paths that required specific knowledge of the facility, routes not mentioned in any initial report, routes that led to the room where the victim was eventually found. The more they learned, the clearer it became that the original story hadn't just been incomplete, it had been shaped. Someone had decided what investigators would see. Someone had decided what they wouldn't. As pressure increased, the calm confidence of earlier interviews disappeared. Statements changed. Details shifted. People struggled to remember things they had once described with certainty. One individual, when shown the footage, fell silent. They didn't deny being there. They didn't argue about timestamps. They stared at the screen as if seeing it for the first time, then asked a single question. Is there audio? There wasn't. But the relief on their face said more than any sound ever could. Investigators noticed something else during that interview. When the footage reached the moment where the person looked toward the camera, the individual flinched. Just slightly. They had believed the system was off. They had behaved as if nothing was watching. That realization changed the tone of the investigation. This was no longer about determining what had happened. It was about understanding how many people had known or suspected that the truth would never surface. Until it did. By the end of the second week, the reopened case had shifted direction entirely. The focus moved away from accidents and medical explanations. The victim's death was now being examined as the result of intentional actions, whether planned or opportunistic. And at the center of it all was a corridor no one was supposed to be in, a camera no one thought was working, and a timeline that refused to hold together no matter how many times it was rewritten. Because the more investigators tried to force the story back into its original shape, the more the video exposed its fractures. And there was still one part of the footage no one had fully explained. The final 40 minutes of silence. What happened during that time wasn't on camera. But everything that followed suggested it was the most important part of the night. The 40 minutes that followed never appeared on camera, but they dominated everything that came after. Investigators learned quickly that silence could be louder than any confession. The corridor camera showed nothing, no movement, no shadows, no interruptions. Yet data from elsewhere told a different story. Access logs revealed doors opening in areas outside the camera's view. Phone records showed brief spikes in activity, followed by long gaps. Not chaos. Control. The room where the victim was later found had no camera coverage. That absence had once seemed unimportant. Now it felt deliberate. When forensic teams re-examined the scene, they didn't look for signs of violence. They focused on positioning, object placement, what had been moved and what had been carefully left untouched. The victim hadn't collapsed where he stood. He had been placed, adjusted, left in a way meant to suggest a natural end, not an intervention. Every assumption made in the original investigation began to reverse. The people who had been present that night were separated for renewed interviews. This time, the footage was no longer hidden. It played silently in the background as questions were asked, over and over, about moments the camera had already answered. Why were you there? Why did you leave together? Why didn't you mention the corridor? Why did your phone activate at that exact minute? Some answers unraveled slowly. Others collapsed instantly. One person maintained composure until investigators reached the final stretch of the night. The empty corridor. The missing 40 minutes. The routes not mentioned before. When asked how they moved through the building after midnight, the response was hesitant. They described a path that didn't exist. The floor plan was placed on the table. The silence stretched. The explanation stopped. That was when investigators understood the purpose of the silence on the footage. It wasn't empty time. It was protected time. Protected by knowledge. Protected by confidence. Protected by the belief that nothing had recorded it. The victim's phone provided the final break. Although much of its data had been erased, fragments remained. Location pings that placed him inside the restricted area long after he was supposed to have left. A failed outgoing message at 12:09 a.m. unsent. Unread. Cut short. Whatever happened inside that room didn't happen instantly. And it didn't happen alone. When the findings were presented to prosecutors, the decision was no longer difficult. The case moved forward, not on speculation, not on emotion, but on contradiction. On the undeniable fact that nearly every critical statement conflicted with objective data. Arrests didn't happen all at once. They happened carefully. One person was charged first, not as the central figure, but as the weakest link. Presented with evidence, timelines, and the quiet pressure of what the camera had already shown, they broke. Not dramatically, not tearfully, methodically. They explained the assumption everyone had shared. The camera was off. It had been confirmed verbally, repeated casually. No one thought to double-check. No one imagined the system would continue recording in any form. That belief shaped every decision that followed. What happened in the restricted room was never captured visually, but it didn't need to be. The sequence was reconstructed with precision. Who entered, who left, who stayed, and who waited. The silence in the corridor became the proof of coordination rather than absence. When the case finally went to court, the footage played without sound. The jury watched the corridor, the movements, the pauses, the moment when someone looked toward the corner where the camera watched quietly. They saw the victim walk out of view and never return. No dramatization was necessary. The defense argued technology errors, coincidence, misinterpretation. But every argument ran into the same immovable object, consistency. The camera never contradicted itself. The logs never drifted. The data aligned too cleanly to dismiss. In the end, accountability didn't come from a single dramatic revelation. It came from the realization that the truth had always been present, waiting inside a system no one bothered to question. The camera hadn't exposed the crime by capturing violence. It exposed it by capturing normal behavior under false assumptions. People acting freely. People moving confidently. People believing they were unseen. When the verdicts were delivered, there was no reaction captured on camera. No footage to analyze. No timestamp to revisit. Just a closed corridor. A stopped clock. And a recording that had already said everything. Because the most dangerous lies aren't told loudly. They're told when everyone thinks no one is watching.